Hi guys, so I found a video by a son of the former president of Uganda, IDI AMIN Dada, by name Mr. Hussein. And I think it was really interesting that he's on YouTube, he's actually active, and he's been sharing a lot of stories about his late father, who we all know as Africans had a really sly presence in African history. Like the famous movie about IDI AMIN Dada showed the many sides of his life. I felt really refreshed to hear some of the stories about IDI AMIN Dada himself by his son. One of those instances was the reason why he was always calling himself the conqueror of the British Empire. And Mr. Hussein here, who is actually a son, I would believe is a son of Idi Amin, but I'll conduct my own research as regards that. Since he's a descendant of Idi Amin Dada, I thought it would be interesting to understand from his perspective why Idi Amin always called himself the conqueror of the British Empire. We know Uganda, especially in its colonial era, had really interesting relationships with Britain and India and some of the Asian countries as well before they were expelled from Uganda under the regime of Idi Amin Dada. And so I would like us to understand the perspective to all of that debacle and why he saw himself as one that conquered the British Empire and what that represents and what it meant for him as an African historical agent in African history. So sit back and enjoy this story of why Idi Amin thought he was the conqueror of the British Empire.
I have only come here for 5 minutes. I have come as a president of the Republic of Uganda, and also I am speaking as a great man who is the conqueror of the British Empire.
When President Idi Amin was titled Conqueror of the British Empire, the title was a culmination of a policy and the result of that policy. It started way back before Idi Amin was president, when Ugandans were living under colonial rule before independence and were trying to claim their country from the British, asking the British to leave Uganda. By this time, the Asians were seen as the cronies of the British because the Asians were brought to Uganda by the British. After World War II, the British realized that the Ugandan population was against colonization of their country, and they started demanding that the British and their cronies, the Asians, should leave their country. The colonial governor at the time realized that there were increasing conflicts between the local Ugandans and the Asians in Uganda. The colonial governor, as a result, developed the Immigration Act of 1948, which was the first act enacted by the British colonial government. The act was the first time the expulsion of the Asians was brought to light. So the British were the first people who wanted the Asians to leave Uganda. So as Ugandans were increasingly asking the British to leave Uganda, the British at the same time wanted to expel the Asians so that they could stay a little longer in Uganda and divert all the blame to the Asians. However, the Indian government stood its ground and opposed this act, and as a result, the Immigration Act of 1948 was cancelled. So when Uganda got its independence in 1962, now it was imperative that the British had to leave Uganda. There was the question of what should they do to the Asians who they brought to Uganda during the colonial era. To solve this problem, the British gave the Asians British passports and gave Uganda its independence and abandoned the Asians to their fate as they left Uganda. The Asians with British passports were now British citizens and had to decide if they would leave Uganda to settle down in Britain or continue staying in Uganda as Ugandan settlers. While some Asians with British passports remained in Uganda, some other white Britons who were originally from Britain also remained in Uganda. So, after independence, the Ugandans were still adamant in asking for the British and the Asians to leave their country. But they were not alone because the Kenyans and the Tanzanians were also asking the British and the Asians to leave their countries. So, Jomo Kenyatta, president of Kenya, Julius Nyerere, president of Tanzania, and Milton Obote, who was the prime minister of Uganda at the time, met to discuss how to solve the problem. The result of that discussion in 1968 was an agreement by the three presidents to expel the British and the Asians from their countries. The Kenyans and the Tanzanians were the first to begin expelling the Asians from East Africa. Milton Obote of Uganda chickened out of the agreement, although he organized a repatriation following an agreement that 500 Asians would leave Uganda every month. However, there was a mass expulsion of about 120,000 Asians from Kenya and about the same number from Tanzania, and these Asians were repatriated mainly to Britain. Then, by January 25th, President Idi Amin took over the government in the military coup against the government of Prime Minister Milton Obote. Idi Amin's son, Hussein Amin, explains that Idi Amin was not initially interested in taking over the government in the coup. He was actually coerced at gunpoint to lead the coup. Hussein explains that the coup was a response to a tribalistic plot to purge some members of a particular tribe from the military and the government illegally and brutally under the regime of Milton Obote. As a result, Idi Amin and his cronies sprung into action to stop this plot and ousted the presidency of Milton Obote in 1971. Now, under the regime of Idi Amin in 1971, the people of Uganda continued to demand for the expulsion of the Asians from Uganda. So Idi Amin had to find a way to implement the policy which Milton Obote earlier agreed with President Nyerere of Tanzania and President Kenyatta of Kenya. As a result of the mounting pressure on President Idi Amin, he had to implement the expulsions of the Asians from Uganda, which culminated in the expulsion of Asians, the British and the Israelis from Uganda. However, they were expelled with the option that if they wanted to stay in Uganda, they could take up Ugandan citizenship, to which a few of them took the citizenship of Uganda and stayed in Uganda. Following the expulsion of these groups, many of which had established businesses in Uganda, these businesses were then offered to the Ugandans. The criteria for offering these businesses to local Ugandans who were interested in any of the businesses followed a procedure where the interested Ugandan would write an application along with a business plan to be sent to the clerks at the Ministry of Finance, which was in charge of the abandoned properties. After assessing the application and business plan showing what the Ugandan had planned to do with the business, if the assessment proved worthy of sustainability, the ministry gave the business to the interested Ugandan completely free of charge. This way, many Ugandans acquired properties by which they began building their lives after they had been exploited under the colonial era. After the expulsion of the Asians and the British, all of who were British citizens at the time, it was widely ascertained that Ugandans under the regime of President Idi Amin Dada had expelled the British from Uganda. Because of this historic act of expelling the British from the independent nation of Uganda, Idi Amin Dada acquired the title of the conqueror of the British Empire.